Hello, and welcome back to Dev Game Club, a weekly podcast in which two veteran game developers look at games from the past to discuss their relevance and impact today. I'm Brett Duval, and I'm joined as always by my co-host, a man who's getting serious now that he's been knocked out by that monster.
Tim Longo.
Yeah, I don't think you've even gotten to being knocked out by that monster, but
No, I think I did. Yeah.
Oh, did you? Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, that
Oh,
was
yeah, I think that happens right around where you stopped. Okay, yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, okay.
I forget her name.
Sue.
Oh, that's Sue? Oh.
No,
Okay.
I think you're thinking of something different.
Oh, well, the
Maybe.
character I'm thinking of does say something about getting knocked out
Oh, okay.
because she wakes up and then you fight. And then later, a little bit later, you fight Balrog. But yeah.
Right. Okay. No, that's not Sue. Yeah, I'm speaking of Sue. Anyway, let's talk about our new game this week, and we'll set it in its time and all of that. Then people they could know that quote. They're not going to know that quote. We are playing Cave Story, a 2004 independently developed Japanese video game. And kind of, it's kind of interesting because it sort of sits towards the end of freeware. I mean, not that freeware has ever really ended, but like sort of
Yeah, there was a heyday.
there was definitely a heyday of freeware, which started with which reached kind of its apex with something like Doom, but had been around, for a while before that. And this feels like it kind of comes at the end of, sort of the first, or the first big, splash of that, I would say. And it is kind of a different era from what we've been talking about previously in terms of indie games, which are more in the, we've democratized video games kind of era of indie game development with the sort of, later 2000s, early 2000 teens and tweens. So we're now playing Cave Story. I'm playing via the Cave Story Plus version on the Nintendo Switch. You are playing on your Steam Deck. So we're both playing. Well, I'm not playing handheld. I don't play anything handheld, but I could play handheld, and you are playing handheld.
Yeah, definitely so.
Yeah. It is a sort of a bit of a Metroidvania, some Metroid, some Castlevania in there, but it's definitely its own thing as well. But you can clearly see those inspirations. I think it's interesting to talk about a game like this, which influenced a lot of independent game developers who came in that kind of second wave, more democratized, sort of setting, which is funny. We played, Fez and and some of the other games that were in that indie game, the movie, were also like not developed on an engine. Like they developed their own engine as well. Daisuke Amaya, who was also known as Pixel, did this all himself over the course of 5 years while he was also working as, what in Japan they call a salaryman, which is to say he just had a day job. I wasn't able to find much about what that job was, but he was basically, doing this in his spare time. We don't really think of Japan as necessarily having a big independent sort of game ethos. But part of that is sort of our understanding of Japanese culture, and part of it is just our ignorance, right? Because a lot of those games aren't going to make it here. They're not going to get translated, for example, which makes it, harder for them to cross into the English speaking world, for example. But for those who are interested, we won't go into it, but Kara Ellison, who went around the world couch surfing, talking with indie game developers all around the world back in, I think I said 2014. He did a couple of articles with The Guardian, and she also, these would have been a chapter in her book as well. So if people are interested in that kind of scene, that is very much a scene, and something like Downwell comes from that scene as well on the phones. So I mean, there has been a scene. It's just something that's pretty opaque to me. And this game, as well as Downwell, strike me as like rare, things that break out of that market and cross to our shores. What was your knowledge of Cave Story before we started doing this sort of indie kick?
Not too much actually. I mean, I knew of it from back in the day. We were working on Republic
Yeah, we were finishing
Commando.
Republic Commando. Yeah, this
Um,
this actually came out in Japan, I believe, 3 days, 2 days before my last day at Lucas. Might have been my last day at LucasArts. It came out on December 20th, which might have been
mm,
my last day at LucasArts.
yeah, so it actually might have really mostly fallen into a gap for me because I was, I left the industry for a bit there, but I do remember it being having a bit of a infamous, reputation for being this indie game that was high quality and kind of a I don't know. I'll call it a darling before there really were that many indie
Hmm.
darlings.
Hmm.
And then it ended up getting ported a lot, and just was. I don't know why it's a similar answer to some of the other games that we've played, and like Fez or whatever. I don't really can't put my finger on why I wouldn't have played it back then because I love the genre so much, but it just never. Um, Probably the Wii would have been the first one I would have had a chance to play it on, but even that, I guess I would have been at Crystal at that point. So I was playing Nintendo games or something. So just I don't know, just never quite hit, but just had a bit of a reputation. But I honestly, until we started playing it and we were digging more deeply into the history, I didn't know the details for sure about him doing it over 5 years in his free time, which seems like a rare thing to us, uh, and then having a sense of the timeline of everything, knowing that this game was an influence for other games post that, whether it be Super Meat Boy or something like that, right? So there was, I think, I can imagine though he wasn't a part of the same direct community. We know that he did a talk at GDC, for instance, and for Western developers, a lot of people, especially though developers from all over the world go to GDC, I would say it's probably easily dominated by Western developers.
Oh yeah,
When Japanese developers do talks at GDC, which is fairly rare because, as we know, culturally, that they don't tend to do a lot of open discourse talks like that. When he did his talk, I do remember that having a big impact on Western developers because a lot of us are there, and the sort of realization that what he did can be done. Do you know what I
hmm
mean? Like,
yeah,
oh, you actually can do this, and and though it started on freeware, then getting ported to everything, and then doing the plus version and all that. So I'm glad we're playing it for sure, and I can now I'm piecing together some of the timeline and the lineage here for this game specifically. Now that I've started playing, it's like, oh, okay, I can see that how you could play this and imagine. Okay, I'll get to Super Meat Boy, or I'll if Metroid was his main influence, and somebody else's influence was Mario, you can see how Super Meat Boy comes to pass. But
sure, yeah,
probably not before Cave Story existed. Like
right.
it did need to exist first.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think, we were talking in pre-show too that I think it influences Fez. I know it directly influences um, a another designer who's in Sweden called Niflis, who made these knit or night games, which is about a similarly tiny little person in a kind of bigger world. This actually is, even though I've played it before, when it came out on the Switch in whatever that is, 2017 or so. It was one of my few games I got actually ever for the Switch. I mean, I don't have that many Switch games, and it was one I actually played in its entirety. When I got it. So I'm playing off an SD card, which feels very quaint. But anyway, it definitely had some far reaching influence, I think, especially in the sort of indie world. And I mean, if you were to play knit, which is what I always call it, another one would be maybe N, or N plus or N plus plus, those
Yeah.
games, I think definitely as well. And then the other people I would say maybe would be the Pixel Junk people at
Oh
what is it?
yeah. Mm-hmm.
Q Games, is that what it's called? Something like that, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So I think they'd probably have had at least. I mean, they may even know Daisuke Amaya as well because he's in Japan, and as are they at Q Games. So
And those were
although
a lot. I mean, the core of that company was Western developers who lived in Japan, moved
correct,
to
yeah,
Japan, right?
yeah,
So that was
that's right. Yeah,
another
Dylan
another.
Cuthbert
Yeah.
as kind of
Right.
the leader. Yeah.
Right.
Well, let's quickly, now that we've kind of talked about our history with the game, let's at least put it a little bit in its time period. It's funny because 2004 is a great year, but when I look at the year, it's like, oh, but these are a ton of games where we've actually for the cast played original the original games. We have two games from this year, World of Warcraft and Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines, but here are the sequels or related. There are a couple here that are just related, not direct sequels to things we played, but Halo 2, Half-Life 2, The Sims 2, Metal Gear Solid 3, Doom 3, which we played a fair amount for Republic Commando as well. Ratchet and Clank Up Your Arsenal. I don't know what number that is. Silent Hill 4, The Room, which I have, and maybe someday we'll actually get through. GTA San Andreas. All of those are sequels. Far Cry, which we also played a bit of at the time. Metroid Zero Mission, Metroid Prime 2 Echoes, and we've played Metroid Prime on the cast. Prince of Persia Warrior Within, which is a sequel to Prince of Persia Sands of Time. It's the grittier version. This is definitely an era of like make it gritty, because Prince of Persia Sands of Time is so kind of light and hopeful in a way. I mean, there's a lot of dark stuff in it, but the character is very kind of light and bantering, and Warrior Within is not that. Knights of the Old Republic 2, Star Wars Battlefront, Pikmin 2, Sly 2 Band of Thieves, my personal favorite of that trilogy, Jack 3, which I've never played, but also goes grittier because, of course, when you've got this goofy, cartoony character, you want to definitely make him gritty. Chronicles of Riddick, Escape from Butcher Bay, no grittiness needed to be added there. And the one game that kind of sticks it out and says, no, we're just going to be light and cheerful is Katamari Damacy. I don't know, the one game. There's, I'm sure, other games from that year that were light and cheerful. Pikmin 2, I guess. But yeah, anyway, that one stands out as a sort of not a sequel, not an IP, just a pure delight that maybe someday we should play. Although I no longer have a copy, so we'd have to track that down.
Which one?
Katamari Damacy.
Oh yeah, yeah. No, I never had a copy of that.
Yeah.
Did the DS come? I was looking at this. Did the DS come out this year too? That doesn't say.
I don't know.
Oh yeah, the Nintendo DS was also launched.
Okay.
Uh, maybe it was in Japan, but yeah.
I will look it up.
Oh no, let's see. PlayStation, DS, North America, yeah, November.
Huh.
So
Okay.
just to give a hardware side of it.
Yeah. It was also the year before the 360, right? So in 2005 and whatever, later in that year, the 360 came out, and then I guess the PS3 was almost the whole year behind it. And the Wii would have been around that time as well. Around the time as the I think I could be wrong about that. I think feels like 2006, but I don't remember. And I didn't look it up, and I'm just going to leave it. But anyway, that's we've played a couple of those games. We played a lot of the predecessors to those games, or the successor. In the case of Far Cry, we played Far Cry 2. Far Cry and Far Cry 2 have basically the name in common. I'm not sure you could really say that they have really much else in common. And in fact, that series as a whole, although it has maintained its sort of fun factory, sort of systemic madness kind of thing, none of them have been quite as, they've been more like, hey, here's a new, remote place to kind of be a war playground in. Far Cry itself was kind of weird, had some kind of mutants in it or something, and like it's very distinct from the rest of the series. And I guess it's the only one that was done by Cry. What's the name of that company that does Crytek?
Crytek.
Yeah, Crytek. Anyway, yeah, so that's kind of the year. Lot of sequels make sense. You're at the end of a cycle, more or less. One platform is definitely at the end of its cycle with the Xbox. In fact, this was a point at which the Xbox market was only taking games that had Xbox Live, in them somehow. Which is why Republic Commando has a multiplayer feature. And you can sort of see the end of the PS2 life cycle as well. Some of these titles like Sly had another PS2 title, etc. And the GameCube, not a lot of GameCube titles that I read off there, but there would have been some additional. I think the Thousand Year Door was that year as well, which got a remake or a remaster last year. So um, evergreen Mario properties, of course, but yeah, interesting and a good year. I mean, that you look at that list of
Yeah,
games, you're like, that's pretty good year.
yeah,
You'd be happy with that year.
yeah. Sort of in the which we've talked about before, the sort of 1998, 2002, 2004. There's sort of like some really stellar years that kind of had, every few years happened there for a while. And before the onslaught of every year
Hmm.
has something amazing happening, which wasn't always the case. But yeah, yeah, and to have the game shine in that year and still make the impact that it made in that year is also impressive. For at least the original version, being developed by essentially just him, right?
Yeah,
um,
yeah, it's solo development for the original release
yeah,
entirely. Like not a solo, but I hired this person for this and that person for that, and got some art from somebody. But I think literally entirely
I mean,
himself.
he even composed the music, which is
Yeah,
amazing.
yeah.
The music's so good.
Some of the music in what we're playing came along later, but or was reorchestrated in some cases, but largely it's his melodies as well. So
Yeah. Well, and then I think the other thing we've talked a little bit about, maybe with Fez because of all the ports, but though it came out in that year, the other trend that you see with the indie games of this caliber that have had this much impact is the sort of like slow and steady over a long period of time building momentum, and having port upon port. It's not like commercial release in other ways where you try to have as many SKUs hit at the same time, right? It's like, oh, it's a big launch. It's like, no, this came
right,
out freeware. Oh, it had really good traction. Kind of came out of grassroots nowhere, and then they made a DS version or a Wii version, then a DS version, and then kept going with it, and kept doing versions of it, and that sort of like building that indie sort of, whether it's a community or whether it's just a sort of persona over a long period of time, is another feels like another staple of this
yeah.
progression for games,
Yeah,
which
in particular, in the early ports to WiiWare and DSi, you're talking about actually not even full access to the hardware, right? You're talking about the sort of light access that was granted via, a sort of standard API, but not a limited. I mean, but a limited one that doesn't get the updates, doesn't have full access. The equivalent would be, I mean, and but there's no TRCs or TCRs, depending on your platform. You can kind of publish stuff out there independently on those early Nintendo platforms. The sort of equivalent on the PS2 was that Linux platform. I forget what that was called. It was an add-on to the PS2 where you could basically get some access to the PS2, and then with the Xbox 360 and then the Xbox One, I think they had similar sort of. I mean, you had XBLA, but you had full access to the hardware at that point. But I feel like there was also like a C sharp environment for maybe 360 that you could develop in, and things like that, and the
oh,
um,
you're right, I
the
was yeah.
PSP or the PS Vita, one of those had this. It was the Vita had a similar thing where you could develop basically as if you were developing for Android. I seem to remember was like the C# libraries you were using, but they talked to the PS Vita hardware. Like, so there's been like, it's called Eurosi, Net Eurosi or whatever, I think was the PS2 thing. Or maybe that was the PS1 version of the same thing that I don't think was launched here in the US. But anyway, the console holders have been sort of dabbling in ways to let the community in, let just sort of independent randos out there, make stuff. They won't host it for their platform if it doesn't meet, certain guidelines, but there's not a strict publishing process either. So it's kind of an interesting space. You see sort of less of that right now, but at the time it was kind of interesting how they're trying to figure that out.
Well, I mean, at this in that era, 20 or 2004, 2005, 2006. Looking at the SKUs for this, like it feels like a miracle to me that they came out on so many Nintendo platforms.
Mm-hmm.
They even had ports, you know what I mean? Like, I guess they did sort of get hooked up with another company that
Yeah,
maybe had,
Nicalis. Yeah,
yeah, which probably had some publishing capacity or some connections at Nintendo, but Nintendo wasn't doing a lot of that back then. They have now since embraced Nindies, as they call them, the most ridiculous name. But it's like, okay, indie, it's sort of all the publishers or all the platform holders eventually, like we talked about with Xbox Live, a few times on this in this series, but also probably when we played Castlevania. Um, people, the platform holders slowly came to the conclusion that indie games can sell on their platforms, and so they started
sorry,
supporting
allowing
them.
it. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. I mean, I
more
think that.
more officially, but back then,
Yeah,
to
it
get
was
Cave
not
Story
done.
onto the Wii is
Yeah,
just amazing
remarkable.
to me.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I mean, and I think in the early days of the Switch when there wasn't a lot of first party or third party um, games, in that first 6 months or whatever, there were actually that was actually a great place to put an independent title at the time because there wasn't a lot of software available. Indie
Hmm.
games tend to be less demanding on systems, and so a relatively underpowered to the its direct competitors piece of hardware, they're obviously not trying to compete head to head on that, and they never have. Um, but from that perspective, it's like, oh, this game that I've made that runs fine on on a PC and probably a not very high spec PC will probably also run fine, on a Switch or back then on a Wii, or what have you. Makes it a nice target, and that's how we got to Nindies, as it were,
Right. Yeah.
because Nintendo recognized, like, not only did this, not only can these make money, but like they really filled a gap for them in that early lifetime of the Switch for obviously harder core, high attach rate players. But so
Well, and I mean, we're mentioning it pretty off the cuff because you're playing it on Switch, but it also is flabbergasting to me that there is a version of this game that was ported to the Switch, and that's the version you're playing, and that
yeah,
and that is, that it's like it's not that time necessarily makes something a classic, but in this case, it's the fact that it keeps getting ported to Nintendo platforms. It's on the Switch, which, yes, the Switch 2 just launched, but still the Switch is relatively modern console, albeit its power is not as modern, but that's not its goal. I still love that you can go to the Switch store and buy this game now, and somebody ported it to that. It's not like this Steam Deck's a little different. Like, I actually had to go through a little bit of hoops to get it running controls wise well there, and people just throw stuff onto Steam, right? And it's like, it just kind of like, well, good luck, it's out there with all the other games, but to get it onto the Switch to keep, it just, to me, it means that it's a classic. Like people are spending enough effort to keep it alive as new platforms come out, So I think that's also a bit of a miracle to me.
yeah, yeah. And it plays very well on the Switch. I remember
I bet it
playing,
does.
playing it and beating it, back in 2017 or whatever. because I also didn't have a ton that I was playing on it. And it's yeah, solid game. Totally recommend playing it. Let's talk a little bit about what it's like to play it. We've already mentioned Metroid and Castlevania. I think there are other, mostly Nintendo. I mean, it makes sense that this is a game that gets ported to Nintendo systems because I think a lot of its influences are Nintendo.
Yeah.
But let's talk about how, what games you see in the mix, and what about those games you see in the mix, because it isn't straight up Metroid. For example, it's got some things from Metroid, but some things that feel different. And yeah, what are you're kind of still early, but what are your impressions?
Well, I've been happily surprised. In pre-show, I was kind of describing it as hybrid, maybe genre merging or mixing or whatever. And we talk about that a lot on the podcast. But in this case, I was surprised. Just to give a specific example, like I've only found the 2 weapons so far, but each weapon you can level up at least 3 levels, and that as an example of this intermixture of combat mechanics with leveling, but then taking hits can, de-level your weapons, and this constant sort of back and forth of that is very fascinating to me. I get a little bit of a Mega Man, like Capcom influence in there as well, like the
Interesting.
Capcom sort of tonal aspects of it. And then the other sort of, medium to large surprise, which I'm trying to parse the influence here. I guess maybe trying to think of, maybe Bionic Commando might have had some of this going on, but like there's a story, there's narrative, and
Sure. Yeah. Yeah.
and Sega was doing some of that with some of the Sonic games at some point, where they're trying to really give. Nintendo doesn't really spend. They introduced Bowser, and he breaks a castle, and then you go chase him, or whatever. Like there's not
Well,
much.
there's a little more than that in Metroid, for example.
Metroid has some, yeah, but it's still sort of this general concept. I actually was playing Super Metroid actually last month, restarted it, and it still just gives you the general concept of what's going on. We played Zero right when we played Prime, and there's a lot more going on there, which was interesting. But I think one of the pure elements of the Nintendo games that I
I
appreciate.
played Fusion, I think, while we played.
Oh, sorry, it was Fusion. No, you're right. I might have also started Zero, but
Yeah,
Fusion was the
I
one I
haven't
went.
played Zero ever,
There's
but yeah.
more going on, more story going on in Fusion, which it sounds like is they're piggybacking off for Prime 4. But anyway, I've always appreciated Nintendo's commitment, and we've talked about this with Zelda as well, and they even do this to a staggering degree in Breath of the Wild. Even though the game is so big, the narrative, so to speak, is still very minimalistic. It's very, there's more there, but not a lot. It's still very myth oriented.
Right.
And so the fact that in here, I feel like Sega, Capcom, some of the others have done a little more of this. Of course, Square's bread and butter in this era. I'm surprised to see dialogue come up. I'm surprised to see character portraits come up. There's actually multiple characters. I'm starting to already have a trouble keeping, telling them apart, because there's so many, or not telling them apart, but remembering them, because
Right.
there's
Sure.
so many in play. So it's been a nice, like, it's more of an adventure, I guess I'll say, than I thought it was going to be.
Yeah.
I do consider Metroid an adventure, but it's much more of a
It's a solo
mission.
adventure. Yeah.
This is
Yeah.
like a world. You're going to a a
Yeah.
cemetery,
That
and
has some like Earthbound in it, right? In a
yeah,
way.
Earthbound. That was the one I couldn't think of, because
Yeah.
especially the character.
Yeah.
That was one that came to mind.
Yeah. Yeah.
How about you? I
think
mean,
that
is
works.
that's one that comes to mind for you?
That's one comes to mind in part because you've got this sort of, this little village of people, and I mean, Earthbound's it's definitely its own thing, and it's much more of a sort of JRPG. But
But I just more tonally,
yeah,
I
but
think. I feel like.
tonally, I think it does very much fit in that mold, and I do think that there's even in a way more Castlevania in this than Metroid, just because of the, Castlevania has always been a little more narrative heavy, right? Not a lot, obviously, but I think more so than Metroid. Well, it depends on the Metroid, but of this kind of prior to this game, I would say, that there's kind of more story in that, and it definitely has that feel. I mean, you're in this place, and there's, 6 or 7 Mimagi villagers that you're talking to, and yeah, I don't keep their names straight. There's a guy who's the head of the village, and then his number two is the assistant to the regional
King.
manager. Yeah, King, and the assistant to the regional
Yeah.
manager, who's number two, whose name I forget.
Yeah.
Togoro, or yeah,
Toroko.
Toroko. I think,
Yeah.
anyway, and then there's a character who's like basically, kind of quivering in fear in one spot, and then there's Arthur and Sue. You don't even know that you've met Arthur as a player yet. You may not realize that at all yet. Sue is kind of this headstrong Mimagi who's not going to take no for an answer. There's a dude who's fishing, but like they're in different screens, and like they move around. So it definitely has some
There's
of
a
that sort of,
village, right?
yeah.
It
There's a
feels a little
village location.
Zelda-like in that
Yeah.
way. Yeah. Well, and then I think the other
Oh
thing is
yeah,
like
Zelda's of course another good. Yeah.
the
Good choice.
opening sets up some mysteries of like who is Kazuma, um, who is Sue, right? And then there's even some mention, not that we have to get into this too deeply. I'm not intending to talk about the story. It's more of just examples to prove the point that one of them recently said to me, "Oh, are you from the surface or
Right.
something?
Yeah.
The letters on your hat are not from around here."
Yeah.
So there's like, okay, clearly I'm like this. I don't actually know what I am. I think I'm a little boy, but I look at some of the artwork and I'm like, oh, maybe I'm not a boy per se, like a real boy.
Yeah.
Maybe it's a Pinocchio thing. I don't know. Maybe I'm a robot, but I'm not a rabbit or whatever
Yeah. They're
the
sort of rabbit
Mamaga
like.
are.
Yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, it's just
And of course they're in caves, right? That's why
yeah, and
it's a
there's this
cave story.
underground.
Yeah.
It's a floating island apparently. They talk about islands and getting off the island. Then there's these weird eggs. So he just did a great job. Like again, this goes back to themes that I think we talked about, especially with Fez, of within an indie space, especially a solo developer, you all you have are yeses, right? You can do what you want, and have fun and be playful with having a wide range of those influences kind of be merged into one game. And if you wanted the story to have some mystery and some, in the Nintendo sort of playbook, I think that they probably do have a certain ceiling to complexity of story for their first party games.
Yeah.
Complexity of narrative, I'll just say generally, or of fiction. But when you're unleashed to be able to do what you want to do, like if he wants to add in some of this sort of these nuanced elements, then he can do that. And that's I think obviously a great thing about the indie space. Little did he know, I think, of
Yeah.
the influence.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, and I think that, you've already mentioned some of the sort of systemic stuff that definitely sets it apart and makes it its own thing. That there are, like any other, like a Metroid game, there are multiple weapons and things like that, but these are leveled up by basically, as you kill things, they might drop things that kind of level everything up. It's really charming in its sort of, I don't know, small numbers. It's like you need 15 points to level from
Yeah,
level 1 to
right.
level 2 or whatever it is. I don't know if it's 15, but whatever it is, it's some small double digit number. And you're like, that is not how games typically work. It's like, it's like thousands of whatever to power up the thing. And even though it might really only be 10, it's 10,000, you only get increments of 1,000 as it turns out. But he just kind of like goes in that kind of small scale, charming, like mentally, something you wrap your head around mentally, kind of scope of a thing of like, oh, I get 10 points or 12 points or 15 or whatever. When I finished, I because I plugged it in again today, I had my original save, which I kept, and I was like, oh, I had 45 health. When I ended this game, you start with 3. Like, so that's kind of like the scope, that you're talking
Mhm.
about in terms of growth. It's not a super long game. We're going to play it in a couple of sessions. I will endeavor to finish it again. It does. I'm playing it on easy this time out, which is nice, because I do remember towards the end it got a bit difficult for me. I think. I hope I'm remembering it correctly as this game. Then,
It has a bit of a reputation for that, so
okay,
I'm not
yeah,
surprised to hear it.
yeah,
I'm playing on easy as well for the same reason, but
yeah.
just
Just
because
to
of
be
the
able to
podcast.
yeah, be able to get through it. I definitely feel like it was. I played it on the sort of normal mode, I believe, when I originally played it, and it was it had a spike at the end, is my recollection.
Mm.
So it'd be nice to be on the easier mode and feel like we can get through it. Yeah, there's these eggs and the sky dragons, and I'm pretty sure you fight one of those at the end. Not to not to not to spoil the ending for you, but you might be able to read that that's
It's
coming.
good. It's good foreshadowing. I mean, they talk about it, and they're
Yeah,
like,
they
"I
do.
wonder,
Yeah,
could they really exist?"
yeah.
Kind of stuff. And it's like, okay,
Yeah, you'll see more of it really soon after what you've played as well, and you'll be like, "Oh, okay, they must be quite big," because you'll see their eggs, and you're like, "Oh, that egg is sizable." Like, even in D
oh,
and D,
I've
like,
gone inside the egg.
oh, have you? Oh, okay, you
Yeah.
did get that far. Okay, yeah, I'm gonna have a hard time of envisioning
Mhm.
where you are then. Yeah, yeah. So they're good size, yeah, and you go inside them. It's pretty wild. So you did actually then.
That was a good sequence, though. Like the concept of there's like a little bit of puzzling going on there, but
Exactly. That's the thing I was talking about in pre-show
oh,
because
got it, got it. Where
I
you have
didn't
to.
think I didn't think you had gotten there yet, and I didn't want to spoil it for you
Oh, that
to
makes
figure that
sense.
out. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
Okay, so you're
Well,
you're actually further along than I thought.
the
So you're probably
computer
you're pretty
consoles you
close to where I
find,
am. Yeah. Yes. Correct.
right, that they give you the clue in that
Of
one room,
which
which is
eggs
great.
are important. Yeah.
Yeah, very clever. And it's just fun because it's like the reason again I keep coming back to genre mixing, um, because the big companies have sort of formulas that they want to stick to mitigate risk and stuff. You can have these little puzzly elements and these interactable elements. Like you find consoles, there's like almost like emails or something. You're seeing text and IMs on some computers you find, and then in that one room you're reading each of the consoles, the computer consoles, and then it tells you which eggs you can go inside essentially, or that you should investigate. You're picking up items like you do in, say, the original Metal Gear. So there's which are basically keys that aren't keys, or in some cases actual keys.
Yeah. You do pick up some straight up keys, but then there's some times where you pick up some ingredients where somebody's going to make you something out of those ingredients that'll be a key and things like
Yeah,
that.
that's
Yeah.
great. And then like I found some like plants and red petals on the ground that are just
Hmm.
like a little bit of information that I assume is going to come up later. But it's like, huh? It's like there's like a lot of little tidbits there, that are just very like just fascinating and intriguing to see in a game like this where there's just more. Like to be honest, in a Metroid game, even I haven't played Dread, but the one before that I'm blanking on, the 2.5D one, that was done by a third
Oh,
third party company,
right.
but
Yeah. Yeah.
um,
Yeah. Yeah.
but
Yeah. I
even
got
in
it. It
the
was on your 3DS. That's why I have your 3DS.
yeah, they still, I mean, they still have their sort of what I would call myth level story. But I still would love to like have some more interactables like that where you find a computer console that gives you a little bit more narrative collectible. They just don't do that a lot. Breath of the Wild is the only one that I've really seen them dabble in that, but even that is still very minimalistic. The biggest collectible in that game was the visions, the memories or whatever they were called. And there's only like 10 of those in the whole game or something. And it
Right.
barely gives you anything. They're beautiful, but that's their thing. But in this game, it's so nice that it was just such a surprise, I guess, to me to go in and read the chat from the previous person using that computer. You know what I
Yeah,
mean?
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Or putting two and two together, like another little great tidbit was you come upon the computer that Sue would have been reading, and I can think it's in Nicholas's or in in Arthur's house, that Sue would have been reading
Right, right.
when Cosimo was trying to reach
To
out
get
to
in
her.
touch. Yeah. Uh-huh.
So you
Yeah.
see the other side of the computer. So it's just
You're
really
like,
kind of
it's really interesting ways of,
clever storytelling.
making those connections of like, oh, this character is important to this character, and why, and like this character is, who's supposed to be protecting the village and not doing a very good job as the mayor or whatever, the king,
Yeah, yeah.
and like how they all connect together and why they're, they have little threads of motivation and movement, right? I mean, the other thing I would say is that to some degree, obviously it's not nearly at this kind of level of depth or anything like that, but one of the things we talked a lot about going way back to Final Fantasy IX was how there's sort of individually coded things, in that
Oh yeah,
game, right?
right, right.
And I think that that's kind of a,
Yeah,
I don't know if that's still really an ethos with Japanese development, but it definitely was something that felt, of that time, to be part of the ethos of, 16-bit and then, the 32-bit machines going forward and all that stuff, that they had this kind of like custom made stuff. And this feels like, as an indie, you want to throw something in custom made for one thing that you're going to do, why not?
yeah,
Because the scale
exactly.
is not, it doesn't have to pay off by being repeated 1,000 times, right? It can be the one thing, and that's cool.
Yeah, I mean, I would be surprised. Maybe I would be wrong on this, but I bet I never go inside of an egg again. That's just probably
Yeah,
that
that's
one
probably true.
puzzle.
Yeah, yeah,
But but I just so many surprises. The fact that well, and I guess to the influences and the genre mixing, I guess one conclusion I'm coming to is I've just played what I've played, which I'm obviously very delightfully surprised by, is that I think it's way too reductive to just call this a Metroidvania,
yeah. I agree.
or to say Metroid. And I'm not, and again, I'm not saying you're saying that, but I think the collective distillation of this game has always, when somebody has talked to me about it, has always been, oh, it's a Metroidvania. It's like, yeah, okay, yeah, it is, but he's having a lot more fun beyond that. I mean, there's
Yeah,
even a little bit of JRPG feel sometimes to me as well. Not in the systems and mechanics, but just in the sort of like presentation and the tone of it. So, and again, I already mentioned Mega Man, and you know, Mega Man is a robot, and then there's like a doctor or there's a scientist. I'm staring at the start screen for the game, and I'm realizing the doctor on that has green hair. And now I'm like, the back of Kazuma's head is also green hair. Wait a second. So I'm like,
yeah, yeah.
the fact that we're even talking about story at all or
Right,
characters
right,
is
right.
blowing my mind for this game. And that being said, there are some, in my opinion, brilliant mechanics with the combat that I just did not anticipate. The concept of leveling your weapons up, but then losing levels as you get hit
Yeah,
is like so Dark Souls or something.
yeah, yeah,
It's
yeah,
like
yeah.
oh wow, so you really this is one of those games. This is a skill based don't get hit game. Um, if you really want to keep those levels maxed, did not see that coming either. So
Yeah, I know. It definitely is like the idea that it would take that stuff away from you. It was like I had forgotten. I don't often
yeah,
remember mechanics for very long, but because I sort of remembered, oh, yeah, it's kind of not, it's kind of its own thing. Cave Story. I mean, it's
right.
got story right there in the title, and you kind of forget, with some years distance from it, like, oh yeah, there actually is, it's not a hyper deep story, obviously, but it's also way more than, some of its antecedents or precedents rather. Well, even its antecedents, I guess. But yeah, and it's really having fun with that story. And it does, like, I definitely feel like Fez connects to it a lot, both in sort of in the character design, kind of the bigger heads, smaller bodies, and but also just kind of the sort of lightness of touch, of the people moving around. They don't talk, in mythic terms of anything. There's no. It's like not the end of the world, although it is kind of dire, in the sense that like this village is shrinking because of this, outside force. This character, so there's, it's set up and the stakes are high for these people anyway, but it's not like, whole civilizations will end, as a result of what's happening here. It's definitely a little lighter, defter touch on that as well. So you do meet a character soon after this. He was like, "You're a really good person," and it's just got that sort of that always makes me think of the Seven Samurai. I don't know if
Mm.
you remember, right? But when the really excellent quiet swordsman is down just practicing his draw down by the stream, and the original translation, and I'm sure this is a really poor translation, but I think it captures sort of the feel a little bit, is like the newcomer, the naive swordsman is like watching him do this, and then he runs up to him and he's like, "You are really great." Is like, and you kind of have that sense, here of like, you're a really good person,
Yeah.
kind of feels kind of a similar flavor.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Yeah. It's something else. I mean, obviously, I guess if it rose to the top of the list for us, then we're playing it for a reason, and I'm starting to now see that reason because I do definitely think I was overly influenced on it being a pretty reduced down kind of game. I was like, well, okay, it looks like a cute Metroidvania. I don't know if I need to play that. I'm talking like 10, 20 years ago or whatever.
right.
Um, but and I'm looking at this page I'm on right now, and I just spoiled something for myself. Darn it.
Yeah, guess I gotta stop.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's
But
it's
yeah, it's
it's
just been a
it's one
nice
of the
surprise.
problems of genre, right? And one
Yeah,
of the
for
problems of
sure.
not, like, the industry not being really good at explaining to its potential customers, and it's even harder for indies, of like how these things are different, and you know it would be hard for this game to find its audience, I think, today, which is a shame, and does kind of speak to, like,
Mm.
I don't know if it was pre-show that we were talking just about how much stuff is out there, that it things just disappear, things come out that might be really, really interesting to a player. It's like, how would you know? Like, you mentioned the Switch 2 came out, and I'm kind of like, oh yeah, the Switch 2 came out. But it's like, even a console sort of feels like it can a little bit get lost in today's environment of games. I mean, part of this, I'm a little disconnected from the news right now, but yeah, I don't know. It feels like the time for this stuff, and actually just like explaining to people that might enjoy it, why they might enjoy it, is a really hard thing that we've never really been very good at, because we're very reductive,
Yeah,
as an
yeah.
industry.
It's at a scale, yeah, where you need to categorize things if you want to try to talk about things, and I mean, luckily we've for for better for worse, we're still doing this podcast all these many years later, and so we're able to we're able to go more deeply into, like, say we did the podcast for 2 years and we played however many, whatever that is, like, 40 games or something. I don't know,
Yeah,
50,
probably more like 24, but yeah.
24 games.
Yeah, a
We
game a
would
month roughly.
we would have gotten a very specific set,
Yeah.
and we all know what they would have been, probably, right? If we didn't do any sort of future planning, so who knows what we. I
We
mean,
still don't.
we played Hitman for the second game, for Christ's sake. So,
Yeah.
um, but anyway, my point being is, like, because we've had enough time to go and play some of these off the beaten path, maybe, and not so obvious. I'm glad that we can talk about this game not as just a Metroidvania. You know what I
Right.
mean? It's like,
Right. Yeah.
and I'm glad, for even just for myself, selfishly, that I now know that there's more going on. And even though the title was Cave Story, I didn't take that seriously. I figured that was just, yeah, the story is the player doing a Metroidvania in the cave.
Right.
I didn't intend for that to be that literal. Again, not that it has a very elaborate, but there's definitely more going on. So that's been nice. Yeah, it's very special so far. I'm excited to play more. I'm hoping I should. Well, if it gets too hard, maybe I won't. But I'm
Yeah,
hoping
I
to
mean,
finish.
I think you'll be able. I looked up how long it is to beat this game, and it's sort of in the 7 to 10 hour kind of range. So it is
Yeah.
not, and it's not a game where, I mean, there was some sort of backtracking around and things like that, but it's not like, that's one of the things about it being called a Metroidvania that always kind of rankles us a little bit. It's not like, it's not that you'll see a door, and there's like, and now there's 20 of these doors spread around that you can
Mm,
only open once you've got the thing. I mean, there are definitely, you know, things that you get where you're like, oh, I can use this. I can think of a few places where I can use this. And they're not often doors. I mean, they're not only doors, I should say.
mm,
So it does have some of that. And there's definitely been a place, well, you've seen it too, where um, near where you teleport to where the eggs are, if you look down, there's like um, a heart container or whatever to increase your health. And it's very hard to get that at the beginning of the game. And
mm.
I'm wondering, is there a skill that
Yeah,
comes
right.
later? And I can't
I think
remember
there's
if you
one door that I saw that I couldn't see a way to even get up to. So I was kind of assuming that maybe there's a longer jump, a farther jump or something at
mm-hmm,
some point.
mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, so there's all of that that's happening as well, but it's not a huge amount of retreading. It's not a game where you probably need a map. It, you might make a few notes to yourself about things, but it does. It's not sort of like that, and not like Fez, right? Which is like crazy amount of rooms and things like that. This is not quite so large in that way. So.
Yeah. Right.
Um, is my recollection, right? So we'll
Yeah, a bit
see,
of a
because
red herring, maybe.
yeah,
About
yeah, I
that.
think it's just people don't know how to describe it. I've heard Firewatch called a Metroidvania or have Metroidvania in it, and I'm like, oh, sure,
Mm, no.
like not really what I would think. I mean, they have a couple places where you're gated because you haven't found the X yet, and they wanted more of that when they designed it, but they didn't have the time and space to do it. Um, so they kind of really isn't any of that, but yeah, it's just that kind of reductive, like, well, we don't know what to call it, so it's a walking simulator, right? To use the reductive term we used for our last kind of little trilogy of games. um, I wanted to ask you last, how you feel about the sort of movement. We talked a little bit in pre-show about it being kind of a floatier game. It's a game without fall damage. I think that might be partly why it's kind of floaty. But what are your thoughts playing it? You're not a
Yeah,
platformer guy generally, so I'm always kind of wondering how you kind of react to different sort of
yeah,
movement mechanics, in these sort of 2D games.
yeah. I mean, it's taking a little bit of getting used to. I think there. I guess I would put it between, say, the Fez and the Fez version of that, and Mario on the opposite side. So it's in the middle a little bit for me, but it is floatier than I like. Um, and I think the discreteness of the Metroid Castlevania games, and obviously you throw Mario in there too. That's just very specific. There, I do. Well, there's even my recollection is there's even some sliding once you land
There is,
as
yeah.
well. So it's like it's got enough of that sort of like in precision that worries me about later in the game if it does escalate, because it is very very much a mastery. Once it's that, once it gets that floaty, there's a lot of mastery that's going to have to come into it. That will, I think, is a time commitment thing to really
Yeah.
get the muscle memory. So I'm a little worried about that. But it's still I think high quality and implemented well. It's just more of a style
Yeah,
taste.
it's more of a feel thing. Yeah, for
Yeah,
sure.
and
Yeah,
knowing the
I'm not
worry that
crazy
I
about
have.
that aspect either. I definitely have already had times where I've jumped and tried to land on like a block. I think I felt this way about Animal Well, which I didn't play much of, but it was like oh, I have to be like this precise,
Yeah.
but also didn't feel like I had tons of control, like that I was gonna, land and slide a little bit, and like, learning to anticipate those physics, I'm never a huge fan of either, because like, well, I'm going to figure this thing out, then I'm going to go play someone that's, some other game that's sort of in a similar style. And it's like, 3/10 of a millisecond different of sliding, and it's going to feel all weird. And,
Yeah.
which is funny because Spelunky has some, some momentum too. And it's like, I know the momentum's different on Spelunky 2. And I'm like, well, I'm not ready to move on to Spelunky 2 then. I'm going to stick with the one I know, because
Oh
I've learned it.
man,
Yeah.
that's gonna be a cast.
Yeah.
Uh, Talking about that thing,
Yeah.
which I don't know if that's a spoiler if we've said yet or not.
We have not said. So yeah, that's for people who have listened this long. That is one we're going to look at next as sort of another 2D. I mean, it's a totally different style of game, but another sort of 2D side, game. I'll be very interested to see what you make of that one, for sure, because obviously I'm a big fan of that game and always
Yeah.
have been. So,
Well, and I think I'm unpacking it a little bit, even just as you were asking, because we did talk about it with Fez as well, and I'm probably comparing it, and talked about it with Mario, but I do think that it for me it does come down to a like I can respect and appreciate when somebody embraces some momentum based physics, or at least the simulation of the feel of that in a 2D game like this platformer game that where platforming is so important. So I can appreciate that, but I guess as I said earlier, my dislike of it often comes in where that, like you said, the sort of the lack of control means that you really have to become one with the controller, become one with the physics, and the sense the muscle memory has to be something that is really like ingrained in you. I'm saying this a little bit because I'm deep into Dark Souls 2 right now, and Dark Souls in a whole different genre and whole different like you know engine, etc., physics engine, and everything. There's some of that too, right? Where it's like there's some unpredictable elements of even just jumping and rolling and things sometimes, right? Where you have to know where the slop is to leverage it, but you kind of it's a feel thing.
yeah, yeah, and
Well,
it's made worse by the fact that in a game like that, you can increase your whatever it is dexterity, and like suddenly your roll speed is different, and it's like you're learning that as well. Like that part of it is even changing
yeah,
as
I
you
can
go, or
adapt.
your
Yes, right,
timing of things gets faster, as
right.
you invest in certain skills and things like that. Yeah.
Right, yeah, the RPG nature, because yeah, in that game, I've upped my poise quite a bit, which apparently in that game makes my iframes bigger. I have more
Oh,
of them, so that's helped me. But
check
every
out the
time
big iframes on Tim.
but to contrast it to a game that everyone knows I love as well, a somewhat recent game for me, but it's been a while. Hollow Knight that has learned behavior when it comes to the jumping and the platforming, but it has more precision that I feel like I was able to memorize and grok more quickly. Even though they give you the challenges they put you through are very challenging, I think the basics of it are consistent enough for me to where I at least for my style of play, I could rely on them more. So it'll be interesting to see for Cave Story because I did know that it had a little bit of an infamous difficulty curve, so I definitely am worried about that. I definitely could hit a wall. I could see myself hitting a wall in this game and not finishing it, but I'll do my best, based on the way that the platforming is so far.
Well, we can ask for nothing more. I'm going to go ahead and put a pin in it there. We'll come back to it next week. But we did have one email sent to devgameclub@gmail.com, that I thought I would read. It lightly touches on the emotional reactions. So I will, and then I'll throw over to Tim for any reaction on that. It's called "Gone Home," and then in parens it says "alone." I see what you did there. Ashton Herman. Hey, Tim and Brett. I genuinely appreciated hearing about the emotional reactions you had to Gone Home, and I wanted to share my own experience with the game. My wife had taken our daughters out of town with her parents, leaving me home alone for the weekend. I don't really remember why I hadn't been able to travel with them, but for context, let me tell you that I can count on one hand how many times I've had the house to myself for more than a few hours. Naturally, I decided to spend the weekend catching up on games I had on my backlog, one of which was Gone Home. I started the game late in the evening without really knowing what I was getting myself into. I'm a total chicken when it comes to horror games, and I'll admit I almost turned the game off when I realized that at some point I was going to have to enter its spooky attic. Little did I know. I persevered, and my terror turned to an epiphanic moment of joy and empathy. It's one of the most powerful moments I've ever had with a game. I'm a cisgender, heterosexual man with next to nothing in common with the story's hero, Sam, but there I was, home alone in the dark, at my desk, sobbing. Ashton Herman. So, just maybe some recognition there, Tim. I don't know.
Ash, I'm tearing up right now thinking about Ashton's email. Yeah, I had yeah, thanks for writing in, Ashton. It's good to hear from you. It's been a little while. Uh, yeah, same thing. I mean, I talked about it probably on the episode, but not knowing what I was getting myself into, not even understanding if it was a horror game or not. And similarly, it sounds like I also had not intended to play it in one sitting and started late in the evening and just couldn't, like I think I said in the episode, couldn't put the book down, kind of, so to speak, right? And just kept playing. And it got the hooks into me so much from a narrative standpoint that I think it really benefited from playing it in one sitting, because that final scene, or the final few voiceovers, I think, hit even harder. So yeah, it's a very, very special thing, for sure. And I wasn't sure what, I mean, I guess that's the thing about emotion, and especially empathetic emotions. Like, how and why how can you describe it? I'm not even sure how it happened to me. I mean, like Ashton said, it's like, at one point it sneaks up on you, and then all of a sudden there you are,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
And that is a very, very special, very special thing,
yeah. I mean,
and very unexpected.
it's catharsis, right? I mean, I think is when you. I mean, that's why we have a word for it. I think is like
Yeah, exactly.
that's what
Yeah,
you're trying to build to, and it's a distinct feeling, right? Of catharsis, of like building up that emotional tension and empathy in yourself, and then basically having the dam break, is that moment of catharsis, which he calls, epiphanic moment of joy and empathy, which is, as good a description as I've
yeah,
heard
it's
of
excellent.
a sort of type of catharsis, although obviously many catharses are not joyful, especially in tragedy. But yeah, I mean, you're just kind of ratcheting up, like he said, he can sort of see the, he can see the elephant in the room. Like, I'm going to have to go up in that spooky attic, as he points out, and you kind of, you've been brought to that state, very skillfully, I think, at that point. And
Amazing. Yeah, the pacing, the build up, the not knowing,
not
like,
knowing what you're
and
going to find.
not knowing what you're going to find, and it just masterfully paced,
Yeah,
and the curve, the sort of like emotional curve is not linear on purpose, right? It really does kind of have that sort of that hockey stick at the end, on intentionally so. And so, it really would be amazing to talk to somebody about it, um because it was so well done, and it would be interesting to hear sort of that journey for the developers, to know, like, how that came about. So how that, because I know they had other influences from their past, that they had worked on similar, things that had narrative focus in an interactive space. So it's just that transgression, that translation over from like a BioShock kind of thing to this, is just like,
yeah, it's
well,
a big
mind
step.
blowing.
Yeah,
And then I think, to contrast to Ashton's email, the contrast, the thing that I think his email is helping me with a little bit too, because I think you asked me about other games I had cried or been emotional on, and
Yeah, I did. Yeah.
the only other two I remembered, I think I mentioned. Um, but to put how do I put this diplomatically? To put Last of Us 2 and Gone Home in the same, Shadow Colossus is a kind of a whole different beast. Um,
Well, it's a
uh,
whole different 16 beasts, in fact. But yeah, go ahead.
yeah, but like they're so all three of them are so very different games. I'm kind of thinking about this on the fly, but they're so very different. But I had emotional reactions to all of them for different reasons. But in Last of Us Two's case, which for anyone who watches the show can see, even if you haven't played the games, you know what that's all about. Um, it's orchestrated. They know what they're doing. You know what I mean?
Right. Yeah.
They are trying to create a dramatic tension and dramatic catharsis for you in a tragic way using these tropes from storytelling. Father daughter relationships and loss and lying and betrayal and all the sorts of, all these things are tried and true things from storytelling throughout time. And Gone Home is the case to some degree, but I don't feel as I'll just be blunt about it. I didn't feel manipulated in Gone Home.
Right.
But in something like Last of Us 2, which is at just this triple quadruple A scale, they're gonna like fine tune every little thing as you're going, and it's like, oh, you know what, we're gonna hit them over the head with this. And so it's like, yeah, of course I'm emotional at the end of that game. But Gone Home just had a much bigger impact on me because of the way it was done and how unexpected it was and how graceful it was.
Yeah.
Um, I don't know if
Yeah.
that
I mean, I
is.
think about, I watch a lot of films, obviously, and I think about how, because they are a linear medium, that you kind of experience in time in one way, they can more directly manipulate you. And it feels like that with games like Last of Us, in a
Right.
similar way, that they're
It's very
using.
very cinematic. Yeah,
Yeah,
cinematic
exactly.
focused.
And part of that is like, down to like music and like, literally pouring on the whatever, kind of pouring on the strings, as it were, right? So that like you can see a sort of weepy movie and be like, this is getting to me, not because it's actually skillfully done, but just because of they're just using all the tropes, right? And I've been taught to respond to those, right? It's just like part of life.
Yeah,
So it's
exactly.
it's a whole thing.
Well, it's an excellent point to bring up, and I know we're over talking this, but to your point about the cinematic or linear version of that, I feel like we talked about this when it came up before, but the irony with Last of Us is that I think I might have said something in the past of like, could a movie version of this you know elicit the same reaction? How much of the interactivity part of it was critical to its success? And I'm talking about all three examples for me personally.
Yeah.
Last of Us 2 could have had the same, I believe, and I'm going to get mail about this probably. I don't know how many, Uber fans there are of the game. Excellent game. Love the games. I'm not definitely not trying to, talk badly about them, but they could, I believe in a cinematic world they could have had the same reaction out of me, to your point, using the traditional methods, right? And the irony of that in that example is that there are two seasons of a show that proves my point.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
like, oh yeah,
Exactly.
right, you can take Last of Us and just make it a TV show and it still works fine. It's like, so that's so funny that we have actually the proof of that because the show is also successful. And I don't think, anyway, I won't go further. But then, with Shadow of the Colossus, a lot of that was because my only companion in the game is this horse, right?
Right.
And you're living your life with this horse, and so that I think interactivity was critical for me. And Gone Home, it's like you're reliving your sister's. It's just like it had to happen in that way, because I think we've seen a lot of linear stories with that subject matter fall flat when they kind of try to, be heavy-handed with it.
Yeah. Yeah, it's also super specific and right. Specificity, I think, really helps. And I know there was a lot of research that went into Gone Home's story to make it that specific and land that way. I actually, um, I have this sleep problem where I wake up in the middle of the night, and last night I did, and I finished off a book I was reading, and there is a surprising death, in that I
Mm.
came out of nowhere for me, while reading the book, and it had an emotional impact, but nothing like what something like Gone Home had for me when I first played it, right? And I was like, oh man, I did not like that. I had no expectation whatsoever that this death would occur. Like no, none at all. Just literally no idea was about to happen, and it happened. I was like, oh my god, I can't believe that happened to that character. And it's kind of a, I don't know, literary fiction sort of thing, and it's a little bit more plotty, I guess, than most literary fiction. But it hit home, but still was like, like oh, okay, I see how I get built up to not expecting that. And like, it was the same thing. I was like, I see how that happened. I think
Mm.
with really spectacular writing, those impacts can be even greater for me as a longtime reader. But they have to be really, really, really well written books, where I just like disappear into the language and like lose myself in a kind of marry myself to the text. Like if you read a ton of Shakespeare, for example, like you start getting into the Shakespeare mindset of like you can just read it and like not have to translate from the pentameter or like the archaic language in cases or whatever, because you've just read enough of it that you're like, oh, I know what that word means. And like it just is, it's like if you've learned a foreign language well enough to do the same thing. Anyway, so but yeah, I would agree with you that it kind of, yeah, it's definitely unique in that way. So all right, well, thanks for the email, Ashton. Again, that was sent to devgameclub@gmail.com. We will ourselves retire to our individual attics as we move on from this episode.
Whoa.
Everybody again next week. We'd love to get your reviews as well. We see the ones on the Apple infrastructure, but we think we're a 5-star podcast. If you want to put that out there somewhere else, just let us know or give us a thumbs up or whatever you have on wherever you listen to your podcasts. We're also on the web at devgameclub.com, and my co-host here, Twitch, is at twitch.tv/
Tim Longo Jr. with a JR at the end. I wanted to share a little bit. I will be back at streaming Outer
Wilds. Those jerks, by the way,
yeah,
Outer Worlds.
Outer Wilds this week. A fun thing happened last session, though, which would have been 2 weeks ago for those who were watching. There was another streamer who had finished Outer Wilds. This game has apparently had such a big impact on people. There's another streamer who was playing her first playthrough through for the first time as well, finished on stream and randomly raided into my stream.
That's amazing.
All of her viewers, as she was like, I don't want to stop playing this game. I just want to keep playing. And then randomly found somebody else who's doing their first playthrough. And then two communities kind of came together because there were a bunch of our community was on there and people started chatting and they were talking, thanks to everybody who was plugging the podcast and stuff. So yeah, anyway, it's just a nice internet
moment. There's not enough of those, and I'm glad you had that opportunity. Well, another place to find such interesting community moments is on our community run Discord. There's a link for that in the show notes. And I guess some of your viewing community probably comes from that as well, mostly. Our intro and outro music was written and performed by Kirk Hamilton, commissioned by friend of the cast Aaron Evers, and our logo, that Discord, our merch store, all by Mark Garcia. Have fun examining dragon eggs further this week, and good night.
Good night.